Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
Pharmaceutical contracts are typically negotiated through a costly game of document ping-pong. Templates flying back and forth, marked up by legal teams who are often working from different assumptions about what the partnership should look like. The result? Deals that should close in weeks can stretch into months, relationships can sour before manufacturing even begins, and both sides waste resources on misunderstandings that could have been prevented. Today I'm joined by Gerry Kennedy, Commercial and Intellectual Property Partner at Keystone Law, who brings 20 years of in-house legal experience from Lonza, and more recently from the cell and gene therapy space at Ascend. He is experienced in negotiating development agreements, large-scale manufacturing agreements, overseeing international manufacturing projects, advising on technology licensing, and supporting clients with research and collaboration agreements. Today, we'll be discussing the industry-wide flaws in pharmaceutical contract negotiations, how to fix them, and the critical legal considerations that can make or break CDMO partnerships, from emerging biotechs to big pharma. Gerry will also share success stories from his time at Lonza and Ascend that demonstrate how getting these relationships right creates partnerships that thrive throughout the manufacturing relationship. Gerry, thank you for joining me. So you spent about 20 years at Lonza overseeing facilities across the globe, Singapore, Spain, Switzerland and the US, before then moving to the cell and gene therapy space. What originally drew you to specialise in CDMO legal work?
I worked as an in-house lawyer in a variety of industries over the years before I joined Lonza in 2003. And that was my first foray into the life sciences arena. And I found it really fantastically interesting to do. You learn from the scientists so much more. Being in-house, you're dealing with your internal customers. So you've got the scientists, program managers, sales and marketing, quality, regulatory. And to see the knowledge that is in there is amazing. You learn about the biologics and monoclonal antibodies, and they've seen amazing growth over the years. And the increased number of monoclonal antibodies into different disease areas, it means it's a very fulfilling industry to be in. My family and I, we were down in Dartmouth in Devon one time, and we were walking our dog, we bumped into this lady, and we were talking about dogs, and then she said, "I'm here because I've just had cancer treatment." And I said, "You look very well for it." And she said, I said, "Are you taking a biologic?" And she was absolutely shocked that I knew about it. I think she had breast cancer and she was taking Herceptin. And we just got into this discussion about how amazing biologics were and the fact that people are becoming more knowledgeable about them. So as an area to be involved in, it's one that I really enjoy.
It really is in-person chats like that which brings home to you. I think it's quite easy working in this sector to forget the overall goal here is, to improve the lives of patients. So I know you sort of describe yourself more as a business advisor than a traditional lawyer. Can you walk us through what that means in practice when you're working with CDMO clients?
Yes, certainly. So within a commercial organisation, and you're working closely with them, it gives you an appreciation of the roles that they have to do. You can't just be self-centered on the legal aspects because the legal and the commercial all blend in together. And so you've really got to understand the difficulties that either the quality team face, the program managers, the scientists, and how that all impacts what you do. So in the same way at Lonza, for example, I speak to some of the scientists and they were wonderful in explaining monoclonal antibodies, their development, the specifics of how they're manufactured. And they would do that in a way that I could understand because I didn't have a scientific background. And so that was very helpful. And I would then try to do the same with them when it came to legal concepts. So we might be looking through a customer's markup of a document. And on a simple read of it, it might seem that they've made an innocuous change. And I'd be taking the team through the changes and I say, actually, no, this one is important because if you read this section with this other section and see the way in which they've woven those two together, that could cause a problem for us. So it was always trying to get over in a simple way and avoiding any legal gobbledygook for them. And you're always, in discussing the document with them, say, what are we trying to achieve here? And what we're trying to get to the end of a document that continues a good relationship with the customer.
So for non-experts in contract negotiations like myself, before we start talking about the sort of flaws in the process, can you just walk us through the journey? So A CDMO business development team just connected with a promising pharma company. What happens next, sort of step by step, from that first conversation to then through to signing the contract?
You would always start with a CDA, so a confidential disclosure agreement, something CDA or NDA, it's the same thing. So it's really a document that allows the teams to have much more open discussions around the product, the market demand, and then from the CDMO side, their facility, what they can do and how quickly they can do it, their scheduling, things like this. Once you've got the CDA, different teams go off and do different things. So the technical team would prepare a proposal which will set out the scope of work for the specific services to be done, the timetable, the pricing, and things like this. And then the legal team would look to work on the contract. Within the circles, you can have ones called DMSA, which is shorthand for Development and Manufacturing Services Agreement, or MSA, which is Manufacturing Services Agreements. Lots of acronyms. You know how lawyers love those things. So once you then work in the contract with the customer and their commercial and legal teams, and you go through various rounds of negotiations and reviews of the contract from the legal side and also from the scope of work side, in case the scientists say, we don't need that substage, can we do X, Y, and Z? And there's lots of changes to be made in there. And really, both teams work through that. And once you've had a number of rounds of negotiations, you eventually get to signature.
Right. And so when do you start to see these deals maybe go a bit sideways? What are the sort of key pain points you see? What's happening behind the scenes that causes relationships to deteriorate potentially?
I think it starts really with what people refer to in industry as a template. And the template is the template legal document, the contract, or the DMSA or the MSA. And what usually happens is that is prepared by one side or the other, and then is sent to the other side for their review and comment. And what then happens is you have a markup or a red line. And by markup, it just means the wording that you've put in your template gets changed. So the CDMO, the customer, depending on whose document you start with, they say, we don't like that, so we'll change it. And they will, using track changes, it comes up as a red line, and that's what happens. You then almost get into a table tennis match of sending a draft back to them, and the other side makes their own changes and then sends it back. And these documents go ping pong all over the place. And to your question, where the relationship starts going sideways is really sometimes due to a lack of communication. It's where a new document arrives, having been marked up by one side and goes to the other. And internally, you read it and you say, my goodness, I can't believe the changes they've made. Why have they done that? Or they've just reinserted wording that we had deleted. So it's the communication part that leads it to falling down. And sometimes that can just continue if you just keep sending redrafts back to each other without really stepping back and say, what are we trying to achieve here?
So what are the typical changes that you see bouncing back and forth, both from the CDMO side and the pharma side? Would it be small changes in nuance to words to change how that could be interpreted, or could it be like additions or removals of, whole sort of parts of service agreements?
All of those.
Yeah.
is you're right. It does get down to small changes that ultimately you don't really worry about. I think what I've tried to do in the past is look at the changes and try and categorize them as to major, medium, or minor, and really look at who needs to resolve those changes. The DMSA is a very important part within the overall structure because it brings in almost every aspect of the business. When you have someone reviewing a DMSA, the markup, you need to involve not obviously legal team, but you need to involve supply chain, regulatory, program managers, quality, IP. And so you have many different people putting their comments into a document. And it can be quite hard reconciling all of those both internally and then when you speak to the other parties. So this is what we're trying to do. But I think it's sometimes the communication doesn't really work very well.
All of those different technical teams kind of acting as sort of stakeholders for their own little niche, and then maybe that can break down the sort of overarching high level, what are we trying to do here?
That's correct. And it's really, I see it's part of the legal team's job to identify where that's happening and try and bring it all together to make it easier for the customer.
Let's talk about templates then.
Mhm.
You mentioned them a little bit earlier. Should we use the CDMO's template or the sponsor's template? When does that actually matter enough to push back on using your own versus when you should maybe just accept their document and move the deal forward?
For something like this, you really have to look at it from both sides. From a CDMO's perspective, it's what they do all the time. And so when they put a template together, it's based on their operating model that they have used with customer after customer. So it will always be structured in a way that makes sense for the way in which the work is going to be done. And so that's why you'd think that CDMOs try to use their template as much as possible. On the customer side, Big Pharma certainly has the clout to insist that their template is used. And I think for the most part, if I was advising a small CDMO just getting into the market, I would try not to be too animated about that, because when you deal with a big pharma, they have great experience as well. And so their template for manufacture should be pretty nailed down onto the most important parts that you want. Over the years, I worked with Roche, for example, and they're an excellent company, and they had teams that really knew what they were doing, so there was no problem with using their template. I think as a CDMO, sometimes you might want to watch for the possibility where a pharma company has entrusted the contract to their procurement team, and sometimes a procurement team from Big Pharma may use a template that can be used for, say, large purchases of capital equipment. And that there are certain nuances in the manufacture of biologics that don't fit within that. So you spend a bit more time having to pull out elements to make that document a workable one. But generally, I think you hopefully go with the CDMO one, but don't get too hung up on it if you're a smaller CDMO.
At what point should this legal template actually enter the conversation, and what sort of groundwork needs to happen first?
In my humble opinion, at the moment, it comes too early. There can be cases where it's sent out almost after the CDA is signed. And that can be either a CDMO saying it, or it could be the customer requesting it. Please send us your template. And I think there's an awful lot more groundwork that has to be done in bottoming out the commercial terms. And the way you would do that is with a term sheet or a letter of intent. And this is nothing new. Term sheets have been used for many years. The purpose there is to look at all the commercial terms, make sure that there are no either misconceptions or misunderstandings. I think that's an important part of the job that I've done over the years, is to watch out for those things where you can see from the discussions that although people are close on the point, there's a slight misunderstanding as to what they're trying to achieve, and you pull that out. And if you can do that in a term sheet, then it's quicker and easier to have that then incorporated into the contract.
Interesting. So let's talk about these term sheets then as maybe a solution to make the whole process a bit smoother. What belongs in a term sheet, and how could it change the dynamic?
Yes. So as I mentioned, I think you start with all the commercial terms. So you'd be looking at the particular piece of work you're doing for that customer. So let's say it's manufacture of a large number of batches. So you would identify the correct facility, because some of the larger CDMOs have different facilities or could manufacture across different facilities. So you want to identify that. You've got the pricing. Within pricing and batches, you have cancellation terms. So if a pharma customer is looking to have X number of batches manufactured and then suddenly there's a change in market demand, they might want to cancel some of them. But from the CDMO's perspective, they've committed that capacity to that customer. And so there would be a financial hit, for example, if those batches were not manufactured. And within the term sheet, it allows a lot of what if questions to be asked. So what if this batch failed? How quickly can we get back into the facility? And you're looking at these commercial issues in purely commercial terms. So what if this happened? We would do X, and you would write that in in commercial language, not legal language. Where term sheets, in my experience, fall down is you let the lawyers too close to them. I think the lawyers could oversee them, but it's really a commercial document. The danger is that the term sheets expand into legal wording. A favourite phrase of many lawyers is to say, in the event that X, Y happens, then this will follow. And nobody uses that phrase in the event that in normal life, but you see it all the time in legal documents. It just means if. When lawyers go in and change the term sheet, you end up a document that should only be 2 or 3 pages suddenly becomes 10 pages full of legal wording that has been lifted from a previous contract. And you end up slowing down the process because you're negotiating and drafting it at the same time. So I think if you can keep to the commercial aspects, make sure the teams are really bottomed down on those, and then you take that data from the term sheet and drop it into the template. And so you've got a solid start as a document to send to the other side.
My question was going to be, with this term sheet, how can you prevent the same ping pong effect you see happening with the template just sort of earlier on in the process and then maybe again the second time? But is that kind of the keep the lawyers out of it, and then that sort of ping pong back and forth of changes may be easier to manage?
Yes, it's always helpful to have the lawyers overseeing it, but a term sheet is meant to be a summary of the commercial terms. And so it's for the commercial teams to have that discussion around any supply chain issues, so delivery and things like that, raw materials, who's responsible for those. If there's any handling fees, so there could be negotiation on what percentage is applicable to a handling fee, the pricing, cancellation fees. Keep all those commercial elements for the teams to organise, and then the legal team can take them and drop them into a template.
Great, and then once you've got that term sheet sorted, then you can just expect fewer changes and a smooth process with the template.
You would hope so, because when you've dropped those commercial terms into the template, you've got your starting document. So that's your draft DMSA, and that would go from one side to the other. And when it lands on the desk of the other side, as they're reading through it, they will recognise all the terms that they've seen in negotiations. So they should just be yes, tick, and understand that. Now, there may be some changes that have to be made within it, but you've got a better start to the whole process rather than a template that the other side doesn't like, or they don't recognise some terms. And so they're, as I mentioned earlier, you have this terrible situation of drafting and negotiating at the same time. It slows everything down.
And I know that during our last conversation, we talked about the importance of having a conversation, whether face-to-face or over the phone, before the template gets sent over. What does that conversation look like? How might it change the way you approach negotiation? And should that happen before the term sheet or after the term sheet?
I think it would happen after the term sheet, but before the draft DMSA goes out. It's something that I've done in the past, and I think it's so important because within the template there are lots of different sections where wording has been drafted in a way that suits what you want to do, either as a CDMO or as the pharma customer. But you've got to convey that to the other side to say, and this is the purpose really of the call, to take the other side through the draft DMSA to say, if you look at this particular section, it's worded in this way, this is what we're trying to achieve. If you read it a different way, that's fine, but we wanted to let you know this is what we're trying to do, so that you have that knowledge when you conduct your analysis of our document and start doing some red line changes. The biggest problem with the ping pong effect of drafts is you start with a misunderstanding. One side redrafts it on the basis of that misunderstanding, it puts in new wording and sends it to the other side. And if there's no discussion at that point, the other side then react to that. And so it's a misunderstanding based on an earlier misunderstanding. And so I think I would always recommend you have a call at the beginning, say this is what we're trying to do. But when you get further into the negotiations, particularly as I mentioned earlier, you've had sales, quality, regulatory, supply chain all making a contribution into the document. When you're sending a markup back, you'd say, okay, here's what we've done. Then this is what we've tried to achieve in all these different areas. And again, it's designed to stop the misunderstandings, misconceptions, and allow the parties just to go, we've read your document, we heard what you said, but we're just getting back on the phone. Did you mean this? Or did you mean A or B? Because then we know how to proceed.
Really making sure that you're aligned before the template's signed. How might a smoother negotiation process, how might that actually affect how the partnership actually functions throughout manufacturing, even beyond signing?
I think it can do if it's taken a while to get to the end date, because often the teams are up against some tight time schedules and they're really wanting to get moving on the project. And as these conversations continue to take a bit longer, and this is the perennial complaint from commercial teams really in the industry, why does the negotiation of these documents take so long? And there is good reason, because there's a lot of detail in there. Lots of departments within each organization have to be consulted and involved. So it is a difficult process. There's no getting away from that. But I think with these changes, it allows you to get to signature quicker. And if you follow the continued conversations rather than just sending documents back to each other, it just creates a better starting relationship. The parties have been talking to each other for a while now. So as soon as you're straight to manufacturing, then that would just continue.
Now let's switch gears a little bit, because this is something I find quite interesting, actually. A sort of a juxtaposition between the CDMO side and the pharma side. CDMOs obviously need predictability and certainty for their capacity planning so they can run at maximum efficiency. While then on the other side, pharma companies actually might need flexibility to respond to market demands. How do you structure terms that work for both sides?
It's really based, I think, on both sides being very open early on about their requirements. I don't think you would ever achieve the ideal, say from a pharma customer side. They want to know, we want to order 10 batches, but we need you to have enough space in case that 10 suddenly becomes 20. That's just not going to work for any CDMO, keeping that amount of capacity free for a customer. It may be that they could talk about some financial incentive to be able to do that. But it's really from a commercial perspective, and the lawyers can help with drafting those and putting them into the document. But I don't think there's a panacea to give the pharma company as much flexibility as they might want. I think with bigger CDMOs, obviously Lonza have been a perfect example. They could spread demand across different facilities because they have so many facilities worldwide, and that may be something that you would discuss with a large CDMO. Is there scope to do that?
And then, so small biotechs, I guess, face a different set of challenges than big pharma in these sort of negotiations. What key differences do you see, and how should contracts be approached differently?
A small biotech's perspective, I think the first advice I would give to them is not to try and create their own template. I think if they're small and growing, they have cost constraints, they have time constraints. I don't think it's helpful to them to go off and try and create their own template that they would then want to insist that the CDMO uses. I think the small biotech should just take comfort in the level of experience that the CDMO has, and that the template is structured for the work that the small biotech needs done. Within my experience, a small biotech sometimes is worried about being bumped for a large customer. So they may come along and say, we want to have these batches manufactured, but we're a small customer. We know you have big customers. We're concerned that you will bump us. And I think if they have good advice, they really need, a small biotech certainly needs good legal advice in this area, and that point would be covered in the contract. But certainly, in my experience, it's not something that a CDMO would do.
Yeah, a key concern for small biotechs when facing outsourcing decisions is my molecule going to be a priority when there's all these huge players to sort of compete with?
Yes, it is. Certainly in my experience, Lonza is an excellent company, and every customer was treated exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Intellectual property ownership is also maybe quite a sensitive territory, but perhaps especially for small biotechs. As you're working through contracts, what situations typically arise during the manufacturing relationship that create ownership questions? How do you help both sides think about who owns what?
It's very interesting because obviously intellectual property is such a huge question, and certainly for the small biotech, that's their asset, the main asset that they have to take through. And generally, in the CDMO and pharma customer relationship, there is a fairly clear distinction on ownership of IP, and you would talk about it as product and process. So any improvements that might be made to the product should generally be owned by the pharma customer. So this small biotech should be able to negotiate in the contract that any improvement that might be made to the product should be owned by the small biotech. From a CDMO's perspective, they've expended many years of effort and experience in developing their manufacturing process. So it's important that they keep any improvements to that process, because ultimately that will benefit future customers. And you would argue, if the small biotech was concerned by that, you would say to them, if you're using a good CDMO and you're using their manufacturing process, you're actually getting the benefit of all improvements that have been made in past years. Don't try and push into the CDMO's area and wanting any improvements on the manufacturing side, because the point you would make to them is that improvement that happened while manufacturing your product could just as easily have been made next month on another customer's product. It's not, the improvement to the manufacturing process is not specific to your product. So don't try and push too hard for ownership of that, because the CDMO typically would say, no, we will own process improvements and you will own product improvements. Now, within that, there are lots of, that's very high level, and then you get into some more levels of detail, and that's where you need the good IP teams and the scientists to be involved to make sure there's a clear distinction of who owns what.
Is that part of contract negotiations? Would there be talks about this CDMO will be constantly trying to improve their manufacturing process and that's part of the contract? Or is it kind of an unwritten thing that CDMOs are constantly innovating their manufacturing processes and that's part of the journey?
I'd say it's part of the journey, because they're wanting to, every CDMO is wanting to improve their process to make it an attractive proposition to potential customers.
Absolutely. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? The molecule is super important, but actually how it's manufactured is just as important in terms of the effect it can have on the world. I mean, if you think of microchips in iPhones, they would never have become as popular as they are without massive innovations within the manufacturing process. Let's move on. So if a CDMO's process improvements are creating better yields and lower costs for pharma companies, should revenue sharing be more common than it is?
I think CDMOs are generally under a lot of pressure from pharma customers to reduce costs anyway. It could be that CDMO might say, we've done such a good job for you on the yields and the costs that we would like a share of the product sales revenue, and don't see that happening, because the pharma company will just say no. And it's likely that even if they were considering it, they would say there's a risk reward equation. If you're wanting more reward, you need to take a greater risk. For example, on if you're late in manufacturing batches, is there a penalty to go with that? It's not something that I see being able to happen from a CDMO's perspective. I think they would just create the yields and lower costs to give a better price relief for the customer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. So closing up then, sort of thinking about the contract negotiations as a whole, if you could change one thing about how the industry approaches CDMO contract negotiations, what would have the biggest impact, do you think, on both relationships and timelines?
I would say you have to have a better engagement from the start and really trying to look at it from the other side's point of view. If you have that engagement and you have the dialogue early on, you both know exactly what you're trying to achieve. There are no misunderstandings. And getting the contract signed quickly can be such an achievement. It really builds a great relationship with the customer, and they're eager to start the process. And I think the lawyers themselves, they need to create their own solid relationship so that you could take some of the heat out of any discussions by the lawyers having their own chat to say, this is what we're trying to achieve. What do you need? What's your most important thing on the legal side? I worked with a chap called Dave West from Genentech for many years, and we built up a great relationship on the contracts that we worked in. And we were able to identify potential problems just as they're about to arise, and we could attack those and really just change the contract and explain to both commercial teams, this is what we think everyone has agreed on, and this is what we're trying to implement. And that makes such a difference into getting the contract signed quickly. And then, even after it's been signed, if you do have some issues that arise, you may have to go back into it and say, to sort something out. And if you've got that relationship there, it makes it that much easier.
Absolutely. Building relationships is what it's all about, isn't it? I guess. Cool. Thanks a lot, Gerry, for your time today. I appreciate you speaking to me. This has been really, really interesting.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Dora.